In 1979, a 6-year-old boy vanished without a sound during a family camping trip. No screams, no footprints, just gone. For 20 years, his name faded into missing posters and cold files, until one night in 1999, a baby monitor in a small Ohio home crackled to life. A mother heard a voice whisper, "I want to go home." It wasn't her baby, and it wasn't a mistake. The rain hadn't let up for hours. It tapped against the windows of the small farmhouse in rural Ohio like a nervous visitor who didn't know when to leave. Inside, the rooms were dim, cast in the golden haze of nightlights and soft lamps' half-asleep spaces. The old baby monitor on Lisa Hampton's nightstand glowed with its dull red indicator, quietly humming. Her son, Caleb, barely 1 year old, had been put down to sleep in the next room nearly an hour ago. Before we follow the chilling trail of Samuel Brewer, the little boy lost in the Oregon woods, whose voice would echo back 20 years later through static and silence, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep uncovering the stories left behind, the ones time tried to erase. It may seem like a small gesture, but every click helps us keep listening, keep asking, and keep these forgotten voices from fading into the dark. Thank you. The house, built in the 1940s, held sound strangely. Footsteps carried through the floorboards, and the creak of old pipes mimicked voices in the walls. But tonight, it was something else entirely. She was brushing her teeth when it began an irregular crackle from the monitor. Static, shifting, like wind through dry leaves. She paused, spat into the sink, and leaned in. At first, there was only silence behind the static. Then it came so soft, she thought she imagined it. "I want to go home." She froze. It wasn't Caleb's voice. It wasn't a baby's at all. It was a child, yes, but older, a boy. 5, maybe 6. The words weren't playful or demanding. They were hollow. A longing etched so deeply into them, it vibrated beneath the skin. Lisa stood still, toothbrush in hand, the house suddenly too quiet except for the rhythmic click and hiss from the speaker. She moved toward the monitor and turned the volume up, more static. Then again, the same phrase. Just those 5 words. Identical. "I want to go home." This time, she felt something cold move up her back, like a hand resting against her spine. She hurried into Caleb's room. He was asleep, undisturbed. His small chest rose and fell steadily. No sign he'd made a sound, no trace of distress. She hovered there for a moment, waiting, watching. The monitor crackled again. She looked down. The receiver was still in her hand. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor's monitor was interfering. Maybe it was some leftover signal from a trucker's CB radio, though she lived miles from the nearest highway. Still, she went to the living room, turned on the television for background noise, and sat, staring at the monitor like it might confess something. Then the voice returned. Only this time, it said something different. "It's cold here." The room felt colder, too. The space around her seemed to pull inward. She didn't remember standing up, didn't realize she was crying until she wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the landline and called her mother, not knowing what she would even say. She didn't sleep that night. She stayed in the rocking chair beside Caleb's crib, arms folded tightly across her chest, the monitor held in one hand like a lifeline. Hours passed. The voice didn't return. Only static now. Just before dawn, as the light broke through the cloud cover and the rain slowed to a drizzle, the monitor fell silent altogether. The red light blinked once. Then off. Lisa stared at it. And in the stillness, in the hush between what had happened and what it meant, she whispered back, "Who are you?" No answer, not yet. The summer of 1979 hung thick with heat and pine needles. the kind of warmth that made everything smell like sap and sun-baked earth. Samuel Brewer, 6 years old and wide-eyed with the world, was the youngest of 3. His parents had taken the family on a week-long camping trip in Oregon's Mount Hood National Forest, a tradition passed down from his father's side. They had set up camp in a clearing not far from Mirror Lake, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that swayed like sentinels in the breeze. It was the kind of place that made adults feel nostalgic and children feel invisible, where time slowed down and the outside world stopped mattering. That night, after marshmallows and stories by the fire, Samuel wandered to the edge of the campsite chasing fireflies. His sister, 14 and half distracted by a Walkman, remembered seeing the glow of his jar bouncing through the dark just before he vanished. There was no cry, no snap of twigs, no panicked yell from a startled animal, just absence. One moment, a child was giggling among the trees, and the next, the night had swallowed him whole. The first 10 minutes were confusion. His mother called his name, half annoyed, thinking he was hiding behind the tent again, playing one of his games. His father grabbed a flashlight and scanned the perimeter, already calling louder, voice thinning with urgency. When the flashlight beam hit nothing but branches and fog, fear rushed in like cold air. An hour later, the campground was filled with voices, flashlights swinging like metronomes in the dark. Park rangers were notified. Search teams began canvassing the forest by morning. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters combed the area. Volunteers, strangers, families from other campsites, they all searched. Trails were marked, maps drawn. The story made local radio, then newspapers, then regional news. But there was nothing. No footprints, no clothing, not even the jar he had been carrying. The only clue was something so subtle it barely registered. A ring of trampled ferns about 40 feet from camp, as if something had stopped there, or waited. In the days that followed, Samuel's parents stopped speaking in full sentences. His mother sat at the edge of the trail for hours, whispering his name over and over again. His father, eyes sunken and voice hoarse, stayed with the search team until he collapsed from exhaustion. Time, once marked by meals and sunsets, began to blur. The tent stayed up long after they should have left, a symbol of refusal to move on. Weeks passed, then months. Samuel Brewer became another name in a growing list of missing children. But those who were there never forgot the stillness that followed his disappearance. It was as though the forest itself had held its breath and never exhaled. In Zigzag, the nearest town, his photograph remained taped to the post office window long after the edges yellowed. His birthday came and went each year with quiet prayers, a cupcake left on a plate, untouched. For those who knew him, it wasn't just that he was gone, it was how he was taken. Without a trace, without a sound, like he had never been there at all. Zigzag, Oregon, was the kind of place people passed through more than they stayed. A sliver of a town caught in the spine of the Cascades, nestled between dense forest and foggy ridgelines. Just a scattering of homes, a general store, a post office, a diner with pie that could hush a room. It was quiet, always had been. But after Samuel Brewer disappeared, that quiet took on a different weight, heavier, watchful, like something holding its breath. The search teams had long since packed up. Helicopters gave way to headlines, and the hum of urgency dulled into static. But Zigzag didn't move on, not really. Samuel hadn't just vanished from the woods. He had vanished from them, from the pews on Sunday, from the corner stool at the diner where he ordered chocolate milk with 2 straws, from the schoolhouse mural where he had once finger-painted a lopsided Sunday. His absence was not empty, it was loud. Every conversation began with, "Remember when," and ended with silence. People tied yellow ribbons to mailboxes and fence posts. The old growth trees wore missing posters like bandages, weathered, curling at the corners. Samuel's face bleached into a ghost smile by sun and rain. The photo was always the same. His hair a little too long, front tooth missing, eyes looking just off camera like someone had called his name mid-shot. That photo became sacred, untouchable. Vigils were held in the church down the hill. Not once, but monthly, then yearly. The pastor lit a new candle for him each time, lined them along the windowsill, until the wax stains became permanent. Parents brought their children to kneel beside the altar, whispering prayers they didn't fully understand, hands clutching tightly to smaller hands. People started keeping their porch lights on. At first it was symbolic, then it became habit. A beacon, they said, in case he ever found his way back. Some families never turned them off. Even through storms, even when power bills crept higher, the lights remained. It wasn't about hope, not exactly. It was about refusal, refusing to accept the silence as final. Newspapers aged out of the story. Reporters moved on to other tragedies, fresher pain. But in Zigzag, time bent. A kind of suspended animation settled over the town, like winter frost that never fully melted. Children were told to stay close to home. Dogs were leashed tighter. The forest, once a place of berry picking and trail walks, became something else. Not feared, exactly, but regarded differently. Like a house with too many locked doors. His name changed, too. In public, it became careful. Samuel. In full. As if shortening it would be a betrayal. But in private moments, when a mother gripped a doorknob too tightly or a father lingered too long by the tree line, it became something else. A whisper, a wound, a question that refused to scar over. By the time 5 years had passed, new families had moved in. They hadn't known Samuel. They didn't remember the day he vanished or the days that followed. But even they noticed something in the air, like a pressure change before a storm. You couldn't live in Zigzag without learning the story. It was in the bones of the place. No one saw it happen, but the town exhaled less and less. Conversations grew shorter, smiles wore out faster. And though no one said it aloud, a part of everyone still listened, half believing they might hear a boy's voice through the trees, saying at last, "I'm home." But the forest never gave him back, and Zigzag never breathed the same again. The morning after Samuel Brewer vanished, the forest was no longer wilderness, it was crime scene, labyrinth, prayer. The early sun broke through the canopy in trembling shards, spotlighting trails that would lead nowhere. The Brewer family stood at the edge of the campsite, hollow-eyed and silent, while a wave of volunteers began to arrive. Neighbors, teachers, churchgoers, truckers, from 2 towns over. Men and women in boots and flannel, some clutching thermoses, others gripping flashlights, though it was already light out. Everyone spoke in hushed voices, as if the trees might be listening. The search began with methodical urgency. Rangers unrolled topographic maps across truck hoods, drawing circles that grew wider by the hour. Arrows marked ravines, dry creek beds, deer paths, anything that could cradle a child or swallow one whole. Dogs were brought in from Bend and Portland, German shepherds, bloodhounds, trained to find scent where human eyes failed. Their handlers moved quickly, calling out in sharp, hopeful tones. At first, everyone believed Samuel was close. Maybe he'd followed a butterfly. Maybe he'd crawled into a hollowed log to hide. He was 6. Kids wandered. They were found. But hours bled into afternoon, then dusk, then night. The temperature dropped. Flashlights returned to trembling hands. The woods, once a place of chirps and rustling leaves, became stiflingly still. Not silent, exactly, just waiting. By day 2, helicopters combed the sky, blades thumping low over treetops, sending branches into a frenzy. Searchers scanned from above, eyes straining for the shape of a small boy in red pajamas or the glint of a firefly jar. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a sock. The underbrush remained stubbornly undisturbed, like it had sealed itself shut behind him. The scent dogs picked up something faint on the first morning, a trail leading north, then abruptly stopping near a moss-covered ridge. No sign of a fall, No blood, just absence. One handler said the dog turned in circles, whining softly, confused, as if the boy had stepped off the path and into thin air. The forest was mapped in grief. Dozens of trails were walked over and over. Volunteers marked trees with strips of torn fabric. Every search team checked in at base camp, logged their sections, and went out again. Some combed the same areas 3-4 times, refusing to believe they'd missed him. A pair of rangers rappelled into a narrow gorge after spotting what looked like a splash of red. It was a maple leaf. Rumors sprouted like weeds. A bear, a mountain lion, a stranger in the woods. Some whispered of old mining shafts, unmarked and overgrown. Others blamed the forest itself. Locals talked of thin places where the world felt different, where compasses spun wrong and time didn't work the way it should. On the fifth night, a veteran ranger, gray-bearded, boots worn flat, stood at the fire's edge and stared into the darkness. He had searched wildlands across the state for decades. When asked what he thought happened, he didn't offer theories or numbers, just 6 words. It's like the forest swallowed him. He paused, eyes glinting beneath the brim of his hat. Whole. By the end of the first week, over 200 people had combed nearly 30 square miles. No clothing, no broken branches, no drag marks. As if Samuel had stepped into the trees, and the trees, in turn, had closed behind him. Hope doesn't vanish all at once, it frays, it dulls. And out in those woods, surrounded by bark and silence, the sound of Samuel's name being shouted grew fainter each day, until even the echo stopped answering back. It was taken just a day before he disappeared, snapped absent-mindedly by his sister on a disposable Kodak camera. Samuel stood beneath a towering fir, the forest dappled with late afternoon light behind him. His hair was messy, wind-tangled, a little too long over his ears. He wore a red sweatshirt, faded from too many washings, with the sleeves bunched at the wrists. In his small hands, held out like a trophy, was a pine cone nearly the size of his face. His grin stretched wide and open, 2 front teeth missing, eyes squinting slightly from the sun but bright alive in the way only children can be. There was dirt on his knees and a smudge on his cheek that no one noticed until the photo was developed. At first, it was just another picture in the family's plastic photo album, slipped between blurry lake shots and awkward posed dinners. But when Samuel went missing, it became the picture. The last one. The image that would be burned into 1,000 eyes. The sheriff's office made copies, grainy, black and white flyers with Samuel's smiling face and the word "missin'" bold across the top. The Brewer family gave permission for it to be shared, though the decision was like opening a wound and inviting everyone to look. The photograph spread. Taped to store windows, stapled to telephone poles, hung in gas stations and post offices from Portland to Boise. It ran in the local newspaper, then the state paper, then on TV for a brief moment when the story reached national interest. But the image always came back to zigzag, like smoke curling home. People began to recognize that smile. They memorized the angle of his head, the exact curve of his grin. They noticed things they hadn't before, the way his left shoelace was untied, how his ears stuck out a little too far, the way he held the pine cone like it was precious. That expression, frozen in film, started to shift the longer it was looked at. Some said his eyes looked like they were asking something. Others thought he seemed like he was about to speak, like the moment was just before a laugh or a word or a warning. Time did that. It turned the innocent into the eerie. At town meetings, the photo would be projected on white screens, enormous and glowing. Samuel's parents would sit in the front row, their faces downturned, shoulders rigid. Every time it appeared, it was both an act of remembrance and a quiet kind of torture. The world kept asking, "Have you seen this boy?" And the photo kept answering, "He was right here." Until he wasn't. The Brewer home kept the original framed on the mantel. Not out of hope, hope had become brittle, but because taking it down would feel like admitting something final. Over time, the frame gathered dust. People stopped mentioning it aloud, though their eyes lingered. New photos were added to the wall, nieces, nephews, graduations, but Samuel's never moved, never aged, never changed. And that was the hardest part. As the years slipped by, Samuel remained 6. Always holding that pine cone, always smiling. Always about to return. The fire crackled low, its glow flickering against the sides of the tent and the trunks of trees beyond, throwing long shadows that danced like ghosts too tired to haunt. It was their second night in the woods, and the novelty had already begun to settle into something quieter. Marshmallows had long since been roasted and devoured, and the grown-ups were locked in the gentle lull of camping conversations, half-hearted stories, slow sips of beer, the scrape of folding chairs against packed earth. The air was cooling, but not yet cold. Still, the forest around them felt thick, not just with pine, but with something else, something watching, maybe, or just listening. Samuel sat cross-legged by the fire, a sticky ring of marshmallow clinging to his sleeve. He hadn't spoken much that day. He'd been quieter than usual, slower to laugh, distracted. His eyes kept drifting toward the woods beyond the campsite, always in the same direction, as though he were waiting for something to come back. His sister, Emily, 14 and already halfway out of childhood, sat beside him with a flashlight aimed at the pages of a dog-eared comic book. She didn't notice at first when he tugged at the hem of her jacket. He said quietly. "I heard something last night." She didn't look up. "Like what?" "Probably raccoons. They always mess around near the trash." "No," he said, his voice firmer now, urgent. It was a voice. That made her pause. She lowered the comic slightly and glanced at him. "What kind of voice?" He looked toward the trees again. It sounded like another kid. "A boy." Emily rolled her eyes gently. "You probably dreamed it. You were out cold before Dad even finished the fire. I wasn't asleep. I was just lying there. It was late." His voice lowered to a whisper. He said he needed help. That stopped her. She looked at him fully now, flashlight angled down. "What do you mean?" Samuel swallowed. His hands were curled in his lap. "I heard it right outside the tent," he said. "Please help me. I don't know where I am. I thought maybe it was someone from another campsite, so I looked, but there was nobody there." "You looked?" Her voice was sharper now, hushed but firm. "Sam, did you go outside?" He hesitated. Only for a second. Emily glanced toward their parents, still deep in conversation, unaware. "You shouldn't have done that. You know you're not supposed to go off alone." "I didn't go far," he said, defensively. "I just wanted to see. I thought maybe someone was lost." "And what did you see?" He was quiet a moment, like he was choosing whether or not to say it. "Nothing. But I heard the voice again, farther away. Like it was going deeper into the woods." Emily stared at him, a chill creeping beneath her sweatshirt. She wanted to scold him, tell him not to lie, that it wasn't funny, but something about the way he said it, the way his voice trembled ever so slightly, made her stop. She sighed and pulled him a little closer, brushing dirt from his arm. "It was probably just the wind," she said finally, softer now. "Or an echo. Sometimes the trees carry sound weird. It's not a big deal." Samuel didn't argue, but he didn't nod either. He just kept looking at the woods, eyes trained on the shadows like he expected them to blink. Later that night, long after the fire had dimmed and the sleeping bags rustled with the slow breaths of sleep, Emily woke to a sound, something faint, like whispering. She didn't move, didn't open her eyes. And in the morning, Samuel was gone. It wasn't until well after the search had started, days into the chaos, when maps were already torn and stained with coffee and sweat, that someone remembered the man in green. He had passed through the ranger station about 3 weeks before Samuel Brewer vanished. No appointment, no reservation. Just walked in off the gravel road with a battered canvas pack slung over one shoulder and a story that didn't quite fit anywhere. Said he was hiking solo. From where, he didn't say. To where, even less. He signed no logbook, left no last name. The Rangers remembered him only in fragments, details that didn't sharpen until much later, when everything was already too late. He wore a green jacket, military style, but older, faded. Not army issue, but close. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, stitched at the cuffs like someone had patched it by hand. His jeans were dark and unremarkable, but his boots, those stood out. Immaculate, not dusty, not caked in mud or pine needles, no scrapes or wear, no signs of travel. One of the station volunteers, a college kid doing summer hours, would later say it looked like he'd just stepped out of a store window. He hadn't stayed long. Asked a few general questions: weather conditions, animal activity, the remoteness of certain trails. He spoke softly, and not much. One ranger asked him if he needed a map, and he declined with a small smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. Then he was gone, walking down the trail with measured steps, as though he knew exactly where he was going, and had all the time in the world to get there. No one thought of him again. Not when Samuel disappeared. Not in those frantic first days when everyone believed he was just around the next bend or tucked beneath a bush waiting to be found. It wasn't until a week into the search that the memory surfaced, half remembered, triggered by a conversation over coffee between two rangers too tired to think clearly. "That guy, a few weeks back," one of them said. "Did we ever get his name?" They hadn't. There was no record of him. No license plate noted. No entry in the hiker registry. No trail permits requested. A shadow, in retrospect. When a sketch artist was brought in, no one could give a consistent description. Some said he had dark hair, others thought light. One said he wore glasses, another swore he didn't. His face was the kind that faded the moment it left the room. Volunteers began whispering. Rumors, mostly things overheard and stretched by worry. One woman swore she'd seen a man matching the vague description, standing at the edge of a trail 2 days before the disappearance, just standing, not hiking, watching. Another said she saw boot prints near the Brewer campsite that didn't match the ranger's own. Wide treads, sharp edges, no signs of wear. And then there were the dogs. More than one search team reported them acting strangely in the northern quadrant of the woods. Not alert, not barking, just stopping, freezing, as if they'd hit a wall made of air. The man in green was never found again. No sightings, no trace. Just a gap in the timeline, a missing name, and boots too clean for the wild. Some believed he was just a traveler, a ghost, a coincidence. Others weren't so sure. Sometimes in the retelling, people start to add their own details. Eyes too pale, a voice too flat, footsteps that made no sound. Details that were never confirmed, but clung to the story like burrs in wool. Because when a boy disappears without a sound, without a trace, the mind begins to look for anything, anyone who might make the impossible feel explainable, even if they were never really there. In the winter of 1998, the county sheriff's office in Clackamas began clearing out old storage. Boxes from the 70s and 80s had accumulated dust in the evidence room for decades, stacked to the ceiling like tombstones for cases long since gone cold. A new deputy, fresh from academy and overeager, volunteered to digitize what he could: recordings, documents, photographs. No one expected much. Most of the contents were faded paper and corroded cassette tapes, the labels smeared or barely legible, relics from a time before computers logged everything with a timestamp and location code. He found the tape buried in a folder labeled simply "Brewer, Field Interviews." It was unremarkable at first glance, cheap, generic, the kind you could buy at any gas station in 1979. One side was blank. The other contained snippets of field notes, voices low and distant, often muffled by wind or the hum of the old tape recorder. You could hear boots crunching over brush, dogs barking faintly in the distance, the occasional clipped voice of a ranger calling into the void. A missing boy case, buried under 20 years of bureaucracy and forgotten grief. But around the 32-minute mark, something changed. The static thickened. It rose like a tide, pushing against the voices until they were completely drowned. The deputy leaned in, fingers hovering over the pause button. There was a flutter of noise, distorted, metallic, and then something almost too soft to register. A voice, whispered, distant. "He's still out here." Just that. No context, no leading question, no response after. Just static, like a blanket thrown over the world. The deputy played it back 3 more times, adjusting the volume, rewinding by seconds. The voice didn't match anyone else on the tape. It wasn't one of the rangers. It didn't sound like a man. It wasn't a woman either. It was a child's voice, tired, hollow, barely there. As though the words had to push their way through layers of time to be heard. He flagged it. Took it to the supervising officer on shift. They played it once, maybe twice, before dismissing it. "Interference," the sergeant said. "CB radio bleed through." That happened all the time back then, especially with the cheap equipment they used. Someone probably picked up a conversation from a mile away and it got recorded by accident. Harmless, creepy, maybe, but meaningless. This was a search team, not a ghost hunt. The deputy nodded, said nothing more, and filed the tape into the archive cabinet marked "No further action." That night, though, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He lay awake, the voice playing on repeat in his mind. Not the words themselves, but the way they were said, soft and urgent, like someone hiding in the dark, hoping the right person might finally hear. He never told anyone he made a copy. The tape was boxed away again, lost among hundreds of others. And for most, it stayed that way, just another artifact of a town's long-forgotten tragedy. But for the ones who listened closely, who knew the Brewer case like a story they couldn't stop telling themselves, that whisper became something else. Not interference. A message. A reminder. A boy who never came home. A voice that never stopped calling. The snow had come early that year. By mid-November, the fields beyond the Hampton farmhouse were already covered in a soft, bone-white layer, muting the world beneath it. Lisa moved through the house in thick socks and quiet steps, careful not to disturb the baby. Caleb had fallen asleep easily that night, worn out from teething and an afternoon spent bundled in layers, wide-eyed at the window as flakes drifted down like pieces of sky. By 10, the house had gone still. Lisa sank into the couch with a book she wouldn't finish, a cup of tea that went cold beside her. The baby monitor, an old analog unit, borrowed from her sister, sat at the edge of the coffee table, a soft hum pulsing through its tiny speaker. She had grown used to that sound, the way it filled the room like invisible wallpaper. Most nights, it brought comfort, a line tethering her to the nursery, even through walls. But not tonight. The static began to shift just after 11. It came in like a breeze through an open door, subtle at first, a fluctuation in the white noise. Lisa lowered her book, listening. A faint crackle, then a pop, like an old radio warming up. She leaned closer. The hum flattened, went quiet for a second too long. Then a voice. "I'm cold, I want my mom." Lisa sat up so fast the mug toppled, tea sloshing down the side table unnoticed. Her heart stuttered, breath catching in her throat. She stared at the monitor, willing it to repeat, to explain itself. "I'm cold," the voice said again, softer this time. "I want my mom." It wasn't Caleb. That was immediate and absolute. The voice was too clear, too articulate, and older. A child, yes, but not a toddler. The words were formed with care, shaped in a mouth that knew how to speak them. The tone wasn't panicked, it was pleading. Flat with exhaustion. cold in more than just the literal sense. Lisa bolted upright, the monitor in her hand now, moving down the hallway with uneven steps. Caleb's room was dark, moonlight pressing through the slats in the blinds, striping the walls in pale gray. The air was still. She approached the crib, every muscle wound tight. Her son lay exactly where she had left him, curled on his side, a hand tucked beneath his chin. Breathing, slow, steady, peaceful. She scanned the room, nothing out of place, no windows open, no strange shadows. Only the quiet sound of Caleb's breathing and her own blood pounding in her ears. "I'm cold," the monitor whispered again. "I want to go home." Lisa staggered back a step. Her knees nearly buckled. The voice this time sounded like it was coming from inside the room, not over the speaker, but around her. Not loud, close. She clutched Caleb to her chest, backing out of the room with the monitor pressed against her hip. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely close the nursery door. She stood in the hallway, her cheek pressed to her baby's hair, whispering his name like it was a charm to ward off something she couldn't see. The monitor fell silent. No static, no voice. Just that same red indicator light, steady and unblinking. Lisa held Caleb long after he stirred and fussed, long after he had fallen asleep again in her arms. She didn't go back to bed. She sat on the floor outside his room until morning. Later, when she told her husband about it, he suggested it must have been interference. A baby monitor picking up another signal, someone else's child, someone else's house. Perfectly normal, he said. Happens all the time. But Lisa knew the difference. Knew the cadence of that voice. The sorrow in it. The way it wrapped around her like cold breath in a dark room. It wasn't someone else's child. It was someone lost. Still waiting, still whispering through the static. Lisa Hampton hadn't slept in 2 nights, not truly. Not the kind of sleep that settled in the bones and pulled you down. Since the voice on the monitor, since those impossible, aching words, she had moved through the house like a shadow of herself. She still fed Caleb, changed him, kissed the crown of his head the way she always had. But her mind was somewhere else entirely, caught in a loop of questions she couldn't shake. What had she heard? Or, more disturbingly, who? The voice had returned twice since that first night, never for long. It was always in the same, thin, fragile, whisper, faint, but unmistakable. "I'm cold," it said. "I want to go home." And once, at 2:17 a.m. It had added something else. "The trees won't let me leave." Lisa had sat on the nursery floor, tears sliding down her face, her arms wrapped around her knees. The voice didn't belong in this world. It shouldn't have been real. And yet, it was. By the 3rd night, she found the courage to act. The monitor was an older model, but she remembered that her husband, a tinkerer by nature, had once rigged a line from the monitor's output to a cassette recorder so they could catch Caleb's nighttime coos. She dug through the hall closet, heart pounding, and found the dusty recorder buried behind Christmas lights and an old breast pump. It still worked. The tape was already inside. That night, she waited in the dark with the recorder primed, finger trembling over the button. When the voice came softer than ever, as if it were sinking into the floorboard, she hit record. She caught just 13 seconds before it faded again, swallowed by static. 13 seconds of something no mother should ever hear coming from her baby's room. A child who didn't live there. A child who sounded lost in ways words couldn't reach. The next morning, driven by a pull she didn't fully understand, she walked 3 doors down to the small, tidy home of Arthur Bell. He was a retired forest ranger, had lived on their road for almost 15 years. Quiet man, kind. People said he'd spent most of his life patrolling the woods near Mount Hood. She didn't explain why she'd come, not at first. Just asked if he could listen to something. Her hands shook as she offered the recorder. Arthur played the tape without expression. At first, He leaned forward slightly, as if straining to hear through the static. Then the voice came, the boy's whisper. "I'm cold. I want my mom." Arthur froze. The change was immediate. His posture stiffened, his lips parted slightly, his eyes went far away. When the tape clicked off, the silence that followed felt cavernous. "That voice," he said, after a long pause. His voice had gone dry. "I remember it." Lisa blinked. "What?" "I heard it before, a long time ago." He stood slowly, crossed to a drawer in his kitchen, pulled out an old manila envelope. Inside were faded newspaper clippings, folded maps, and a missing poster. The name at the top read Samuel Brewer. "I was there," Arthur said quietly, laying the poster on the table. "I helped search for him in '79. A boy, 6 years old, disappeared in Mount Hood. We never found him. But one night, on the North Ridge, I thought I heard something. A child's voice, faint. Just for a second." Lisa stared at the photo on the flyer. A boy, grinning, holding a pine cone. "I thought I imagined it," Arthur said, almost to himself. "That was 20 years ago." Lisa looked down at the recorder in her hands, her skin crawling with a slow, sick heat. The voice hadn't changed. Not in tone, not in age. Whoever or whatever was speaking through the monitor had been lost for a very long time, and it was still calling for home. The house sat beneath a ceiling of moss and sagging branches, just outside the edges of Zigzag, Oregon. Long forgotten. The roofline buckled, the windows dulled by years of rain and lichen, and ivy curled through the cracks in the siding like veins on old skin. It wasn't on any recent maps, not really hidden, just overlooked. A leftover. Someone had owned it once, a family. Then, after Samuel Brewer vanished, they moved away without fanfare. The property fell into silence. No one rented it, no one sold it. Over time, it slipped into the margins of memory, like so many things tied to that boy's name. It was rediscovered in the late fall of 1999 by a team of land surveyors scanning nearby parcels for future development. One of them wandered too far into the tree line and found the back porch collapsing beneath the weight of wet leaves. A quick look through the broken window revealed a place that hadn't been entered in decades. When officials arrived to inspect the site, they expected water damage, graffiti, signs of intrusion. Instead, they found something else, something stranger. The front door creaked open with a sound like breath being held too long. Inside, time had not passed in the normal way. Dust blanketed every surface, thick and undisturbed, but everything was intact. The furniture hadn't been moved. Dishes still sat in the sink, dry and skeletal. A calendar from July 1979 hung crookedly on the kitchen wall, the days crossed off until the 16th, 3 days after Samuel vanished. After that, nothing. A void. They climbed the stairs, boots echoing against old wood, until they reached the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Faded blue walls. A child's room. The toys were still on the floor. An action figure missing an arm. A plastic fire truck. A puzzle half completed on the carpet like someone had stepped away mid-thought. A bookshelf sagged beneath the weight of dog-eared paperbacks and comic books. One comic was open on the bed. The spine cracked, its pages yellowing. The image on the spread showed a boy falling through a vortex of stars, tumbling between 2 dimensions. Speech bubble reading, "Am I still me on the other side?" They didn't touch it. The bed was neatly made except for one corner, where the sheet had been pulled loose. On the wooden frame, just below the headboard, the name Sam had been carved twice. Once carefully, in clean lines. Then again below it, deeper and messier, as if with urgency. A child's scrawl in a moment of anger or fear. One investigator noted something else: the air in the room felt colder than the rest of the house. Still, but not empty. heavy in a way no one could quite explain. They checked the windows. No drafts. No broken panes. There were no footprints in the dust. No sign anyone had been there since 1979. And yet, everything remained, suspended like breath before the exhale. A boy's room, untouched, waiting, echoing a name no one had spoken in years, except in whispers. A room that still belonged to someone who hadn't lived there in 2 decades but hadn't fully left, either. The report was filed, photos were taken, the house was sealed again. But for those who stood in that doorway, staring at the comic book and the scratches in the wood, one truth pressed harder than any theory. Something of Samuel still lingered there. And maybe, in some impossible way, he had never stopped calling it home. The forest had grown thicker over the years. What had once been a popular campground in the 1,970 had long since surrendered to the slow crawl of nature, trees leaning inward, moss draped like heavy curtains, roots lifting the earth into small ridges that swallowed trails whole. In late 1999, a local conservation group partnered with the forestry department to map out old logging routes and forgotten trails using drone technology. It was meant to be a routine topographic scan, just a step toward establishing a safer network of paths for future hikers. But one data technician, cross-referencing the aerial footage with old ranger maps, noticed something strange. There was a break in the tree canopy just barely visible on the footage. A faint line, linear and purposeful, running northeast from the area near Mirror Lake, not marked on any recent documents. Its origin was close to the old Brewer campsite, too close to ignore. And when overlaid against the original 1,979 search grid, the truth emerged. A blind spot, a missed step. They called it the Deep Trail. In 1979, it had likely already been lost to overgrowth, used decades earlier by forest rangers and local hunters, long before safety protocols demanded regular maintenance. According to one retired cartographer, the trail hadn't been officially recorded since the early 1950s. To the searchers combing the forest 20 years earlier, it wouldn't have looked like anything more than an impassable tangle of brush. No one would have thought to push beyond it. Now, with coordinates in hand, a team of volunteers and officials ventured out to see it for themselves. The forest wasn't kind. What remained of the trail was nearly invisible, its once packed dirt path buried beneath thick ferns and centuries of pine debris. The only markers were subtle depressions in the earth, a strange, rhythmic pattern in the way the underbrush shifted as they moved forward. It felt less like following a trail and more like moving through memory, retracing a forgotten route that didn't want to be remembered. There was an unsettling quiet as they moved deeper in. Birdsong faded. The trees pressed in tighter. More than one person remarked on how the light changed, how shadows seemed to linger too long, how time felt off. Watches ticked normally, but there was a collective sense that they were being drawn in, step by deliberate step. About 3/4 of a mile in, one of the surveyors found something. Half buried in the dirt, beneath a root twisted like a question mark, was a rusted flashlight. The lens cracked, the switch long corroded. Beside it, a button, plastic, red, covered in a thin film of soil. No clothing, no bones, just that. They marked the area and kept moving, but nothing else was found. The trail petered out near a steep incline, where the earth dropped into a gulch so narrow it wouldn't have been visible from a helicopter, especially not in the shifting shadows of the canopy. That night, back at the ranger station, the team reviewed the footage. One of them zoomed in on the drone's aerial, still focusing on the starting point of the trail. Just before the brush overtook it entirely, barely visible in the dirt, were 2 lines. Parallel. Like small feet dragged or walked side by side. Leading in. And never returning. By the time the forest had reclaimed the Brewer campsite, by the time new trees had sprouted where tents once stood and moss had covered the ashes of old fires, the stories had already begun. They were soft at first, casual murmurs passed over mugs of coffee at the local diner, between checkout lines at the general store. Zigzag had a way of holding onto memory like bark holds to trees, tight, layered, and full of scars. Samuel Brewer was gone, that much remained unchallenged. But something of him, some trace seemed to linger. Hunters were the first to say it out loud. Rough men, practical and not prone to fantasy, spoke of strange encounters they couldn't quite explain. One claimed to have seen a boy in a red sweatshirt walking alone through a fog bank near Devil's Backbone Ridge just before dawn. The boy never turned his head, just kept walking, even as the hunter called out, voice cracking the stillness like a snapped branch. He followed for maybe 2 minutes. Then the fog thickened, and the boy was gone. Just gone. Others mentioned hearing things. Laughter, they said. The high, reedy sound of a child laughing far off the trail, deeper than any child should be. One woman, hiking with her husband in early spring, described a moment when everything went unnaturally quiet, no birds, no wind. Then, from behind the tree line, they both heard it. A soft, breathy giggle. Like someone watching from the dark and trying not to be caught. Her husband refused to talk about it afterward. Told her it was probably an animal. But the woman said it had sounded too human, too close. These accounts were always dismissed when spoken aloud. Locals would nod politely, offer that well-worn expression grief makes ghosts of everything. And yet, the details never changed. A boy around 6. Red clothing. A voice that didn't echo right. All sightings clustered near the same area, just north of the original campsite, always close to the deep trail. Over time, the stories evolved into something like folklore. Kids dared each other to go into the woods alone at dusk. A camp counselor once swore she heard footsteps circling her tent in the night, light and unhurried. When she opened the flap, no one was there, but the next morning, she found tiny footprints in the frost. Barefoot, too small to belong to any of her campers. For those who lived in Zigzag their whole lives, it became something unspoken. A rule, not a superstition. Don't hike past dusk, don't stray off marked trails. If you hear someone calling, don't answer. And if you ever see a boy walking where no boy should be, don't follow. Still, every so often, someone would return with that look, haunted, distant, unsure of what they'd experienced. They'd tell their story once, maybe twice, before going quiet. Before convincing themselves it had been wind, a trick of the light, the creak of a branch. Easier that way, easier to forget. But the forest didn't forget. It held the shape of things long gone. It whispered names when no one was around to hear them. It remembered the sound of a child's voice echoing through the pines. And sometimes, just sometimes, it let that sound slip through again, as if reminding the world that Samuel Brewer was still part of its soil. Not alive, not dead, just waiting. The static had become a presence. Not just noise, but something alive, shifting in tone and rhythm, breathing through the monitor at odd hours like it was drawing from someplace far colder than the nursery it watched over. Lisa had grown used to waiting, sitting in the dark with the recorder balanced on her lap, headphones pressed to her ears, holding her breath for that moment when the ordinary hum slipped into something else, a whisper, a phrase, a child's voice that didn't belong. She had managed to capture pieces of it, fragments of impossible sentences. Sometimes just breathing. Sometimes the same words, repeated like an incantation. I want to go home. It's so dark. The trees keep moving. It never lasted long, never more than seconds. As if whatever reached through the signal could only stay for a moment before vanishing again into silence. But each time, the voice was clearer, closer. On the night it broke, Lisa felt something shift even before the static began. The air in Caleb's room was different when she laid him down. Not cold, exactly, but heavier, like the room was holding its breath. She adjusted the monitor, made sure the transmitter was angled correctly, and double-checked the recorder's batteries. Everything was set. She waited. At 3:12 a.m., the monitor let out a sharp crackle, loud enough to make her flinch. Then a voice came through. Not a whisper this time, but full, aching words. "I see the house, I see the light." Lisa leaned forward, heart racing. The voice sounded right at the edge of the speaker, not distant anymore, not trapped in the static. Then the monitor sparked. A bright flash, the smell of burnt plastic. The device hissed, then went silent. Dead. Lisa scrambled to unplug it, her hands shaking, the cable hot to the touch. The recorder had captured nothing, just a pop, then blank air. She stared at the blackened monitor, as if it might explain itself. As if it hadn't just ended the only connection to something that should not have existed. She barely slept, sat on the hallway floor outside Caleb's door with a flashlight and the fried monitor in her lap, listening for anything with her own ears now. Nothing came, no footsteps, no breathing. Just silence, thick and unnatural. At dawn, Caleb began to stir. Lisa crept in, exhausted but relieved, expecting to find him stretching or mumbling as he always did. But instead, he was sitting up rigid, eyes wide, cheeks pale. Tears had stained his face, though he hadn't cried loud enough to wake her. She rushed to him. "What's wrong, baby? Did you have a bad dream?" He blinked, slowly. His voice came out in a hushed monotone, as if the words had been waiting all night. "He was in the room," Caleb whispered. Lisa froze. "Who?" Caleb pointed toward the corner, to the shadowy spot near the bookshelf. "The boy with no shoes. He was watching me." She pulled him into her arms, heart pounding, breath catching. She wanted to tell him it was just a dream, that nothing had been there, that he was safe. But she couldn't, because she knew, because she had heard the voice too. And now, the monitor, the only device that had captured it, was gone. Fried, melted, silenced. But the presence wasn't. It had moved closer. From static to speech, from whisper to room. And now, it was watching. Lisa never intended to send the tape to anyone. It had become something private, something too sacred and strange to share with strangers in labs or suits, or headphones too big for the human ear. But the night Caleb spoke of the boy with no shoes, something inside her shifted, something maternal, primal. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't about belief anymore. It was about her son. And whatever was reaching through that static wasn't finished. She called Arthur Bell first, the retired forest ranger who had once stood among the search teams combing Mount Hood for a boy that had simply ceased to exist. She played him the most intact recording she had, taken before the monitor burned out. His reaction was immediate. He grew pale, mouth tight, like the words were a cold wind against his bones. "That's the same voice," he said softly. "I'd bet my life on it." But memory was fragile, and feelings weren't evidence. Lisa needed more. Through a mutual friend, she reached out to a professor at the University of Oregon who specialized in acoustic forensics. He was reluctant at first, accustomed to analyzing courtroom recordings, not the whisperings of lost children through ancient baby monitors. But curiosity has a way of overtaking skepticism. She sent him the clip with no context, just 13 seconds of quiet, chilling audio, the boy's voice faint beneath a river of static. It took 3 days for him to respond. When he did, it was by phone. His voice was clipped, unsettled, like he had been thinking about it too long. "You need to tell me where you got this," he said. Lisa hesitated. "What did you find?" "I ran it through multiple vocal analysis programs," he continued. "Cross-referenced it against public records. Radio signal distortions, mimicry software. Anything that could explain a hoax. But that's not what this island." She said nothing, let him speak. The pitch, the cadence, the frequency of breath. Even the way he pronounces his L's, it's all there. A slight lateral lisp. In forensic linguistics, we call these vocal fingerprints. They're almost as unique as DNA. Lisa felt the room tilt. I also found archived recordings from local broadcasts in 1979, he went on. Public appeals. One of them had a clip of the boy's voice, Samuel Brewer. Just a few seconds, enough to compare. He paused, as if needing to take a breath. It's the same voice, not similar, the same. Lisa gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles went white. That's not possible, she whispered. He's been gone for 20 years. I don't know what you're dealing with, the professor admitted. But it's not a child in your neighborhood. It's not interference. It's not a hoax. And if someone is fabricating this, they've recreated the voice of a dead boy down to a level of precision I've never seen. She wanted to feel relieved, validated, but instead, the confirmation landed like a stone in her stomach. Because there were no explanations left that made sense. Just one question that hung heavy in the silence between them. How can a boy who vanished in 1979 still be asking for his mother in 1999? The professor asked if she would send more. Said he could continue analyzing. But Lisa declined. She thanked him. Said she needed time. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long time, her gaze drifting toward Caleb's room, where her son was napping peacefully. In her pocket, the recorder still felt warm. She hadn't played the newest tape yet, the one she'd made just before the monitor finally died. She wasn't sure she was ready. Because now she knew who the voice belonged to. And that meant something else entirely. He was still out there. Still speaking. Still waiting to be found. It was a late winter storm, the kind that comes uninvited after the first signs of spring. Sheets of rain lashed the upper slopes of Mount Hood for days, saturating the ground beyond its limit. Trees groaned and leaned. The mountain, patient and unmoved for centuries, finally gave way in a single, sudden heave. A section of hillside, long overlooked and overgrown, collapsed into itself with a roar that echoed through the valley like thunder, tearing something loose from time. Locals heard it from miles away. A tremor beneath the feet. A hush that followed. Search and rescue teams were dispatched out of precaution, assuming hikers might have been caught in the slide. But when they arrived at the site, they found something else entirely. Beneath the debris of wet earth and splintered pine, the mountain had revealed an opening. A cavity in the stone, jagged and narrow, barely taller than a child. It had been sealed for decades, maybe longer. Nature had hidden it well, covered by underbrush, guarded by the incline, completely invisible to any of the dozens of searchers who had scoured the area 20 years before. Now, it yawned open like a mouth in mid-sentence, as though it had been waiting for just the right moment to speak. The cave went deeper than expected. A few rangers, equipped with lights and rope, descended into the hollow. They moved slowly, each footstep stirring old air that smelled of earth and something older, something untouched. The passage narrowed, then opened again into a small chamber. It wasn't large, but the walls curved inward like a cradle, and the floor was uneven with rock and root. It was there they found it. A single child's shoe. Small, red canvas, the kind with Velcro straps, and a faded cartoon character barely visible on the side. It was preserved eerily well, as if time had paused around it. Beside the shoe, half buried in dirt, was a pine cone. Dry, fragile. Its scales still fanned out, as if it had been placed there, not fallen. No bones. No clothing. No sign of anyone else. Just those two objects, side by side. The scene was photographed, carefully catalogued. The shoe was taken in for analysis, and the pinecone strangely was too. The cave was sealed off, marked for further excavation. But the rangers who had gone inside emerged changed, each one visibly shaken, though none of them would say exactly why. One muttered something to a colleague on the hike back. It didn't feel empty. The shoe was rushed to a forensic lab. The Velcro was frayed, the fabric torn slightly at the toe, but the inner lining still bore a name written in faded black marker, S. Brewer. DNA tests were ordered immediately. Hair fibers, if any remained, would take time to analyze. But inside the shoe's sole, tucked beneath the insole, a technician found something unexpected. A thread of fabric, too thin to have come from a sock, coiled like a tiny ribbon. It was embedded deep, as if it had been forced down and forgotten. Lisa Hampton heard about the discovery from Arthur Bell. He called her late that night, his voice tight with something like awe. "They found something," he said, "near the deep trail." When she asked what, his silence answered first. Then, softly, "I think they found where he stopped." She didn't ask who he was. She already knew. And now, the forest had given up a piece of him, a clue buried beneath years of silence, unearthed by chance or something far older. The cave had opened, and whatever it had held for so long had finally begun to let go. The monitor hadn't worked in weeks. Its casing was cracked, the circuitry burned, rendered silent by the night it had sparked itself into ruin. But Lisa couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It sat on the dresser in Caleb's room like a monument, hollow, lifeless, and heavy with meaning. The recorder, though, still functioned. She kept it near, just in case. Some part of her couldn't let go of the idea that Samuel was still reaching through, still lingering on the edge of sound, waiting to be heard. But for days, there had been nothing. Not even static. Just silence. Then, one night in early spring, the air changed. It was subtle, like the moment between a breath and a sigh. Lisa had just tucked Caleb in. He was sleeping soundly, curled on his side, the soft rhythm of his breathing steady and warm. The window was cracked open, letting in the smell of rain-soaked earth and pine from the woods beyond the fields. She stood at the doorway, watching him with the quiet ache of a mother who had lived beside fear for too long. She almost didn't notice the red light blinking on the recorder. It wasn't plugged into anything. It hadn't been used in over a week, but there it was, blinking once, then twice, then steady. A faint hiss filled the room. She moved closer, hands trembling, heart pounding so loud she could hardly hear. The hiss sharpened, resolved into a thin layer of static, fragile like dry leaves beneath a child's feet. Then the voice came. Soft, clear. "Thank you." Lisa gasped, the recorder nearly slipping from her hand. "I'm going home now." The static hummed for just a second more, as if waiting for a reply. But Lisa could say nothing. Her throat was thick with something too old for words: relief, sorrow, awe. Then, silence. True silence. The light on the recorder blinked once more and died. She waited 10 minutes, 20, pressed every button, checked the battery, rewound the tape, desperate for more. But there was nothing left. The tape hissed blankly, no echoes, no whisper, no trace. It was over. Lisa sank to the floor, back against the wall, holding the recorder to her chest like a heartbeat. Her eyes welled with tears she hadn't known were waiting. There had been something in his voice, something light, unburdened. For the first time, he hadn't sounded lost. He'd sounded like a boy letting go. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently. No more calls, no more laughter in the branches. The woods, it seemed, had finally released what it had held for far too long. The next day, the DNA results came back. The shoe from the cave had belonged to Samuel Brewer. It didn't feel like a confirmation. It felt like a farewell. In zigzag, the last candle was lit at the church, then quietly extinguished. The porch lights so many kept on for 2 decades began to go dark, one by one. No announcement, no fanfare. Just the stillness of a story ending. And in a farmhouse in Ohio, a mother held her son tighter than ever and whispered into his hair, "You're safe. He's safe now." There would be no more voices. The forest had remembered. And finally, After 20 long years, it had let him go. The report came stamped and sealed, buried beneath bureaucratic language and finality. The evidence had been catalogued, the shoe logged, and returned to the family, the DNA matched and recorded. The Forest Service cleared the cave. Local authorities, after years of silence, released one final statement to the press. The case of Samuel Brewer is considered resolved. The words were brief, bloodless. A child lost. A tragic accident. Time had passed, life had moved on. But not everything did. In zigzag, the paper ran the headline quietly, tucked below the fold. There was no memorial, no vigil this time, just a sense of strange completion that didn't quite settle. The town didn't erupt in grief or celebration. It simply exhaled, weary and changed, like a clock that no longer knew what it had been counting toward. Yet in the quiet that followed, something lingered. Hikers still passed through the woods near Mirror Lake, despite the warnings. The trail systems had been remapped, new signs installed, new barriers placed near the old deep trail. But none of it mattered. The mountain had its own map, one written in shadow and silence. And those who wandered off-path began to tell stories again, familiar ones, though no longer whispered in fear. A couple from Idaho reported losing their GPS signal entirely as they neared the ravine where the cave had been discovered. They turned back after hearing what they described as a boy's voice laughing behind us. But when we looked, there was no one. A teenager hiking alone wrote online that their earbuds filled with static suddenly, even with no cell service, and they heard a voice say, "Don't go that way." They turned around, found their bearings again, and swore they never left the marked trail. The stories grew, just as they had 2 decades before. But now, they came not with panic, but with a strange reverence, as if those who encountered something out there understood that it didn't want to harm them. It only wanted to be known. In homes around Oregon, and in a few farther places, oddly scattered parents began to speak of odd noises in the night. Baby monitors, brand new and digital, would hum with faint static. Not always. Not predictably. Just once, and never again. A whisper. A breath. One father swore he heard someone say, "I'm here." And when he checked on his infant daughter, she was sleeping peacefully but clutching something in her tiny hand. A pine needle, fresh and green. Lisa Hampton never heard the voice again. She kept the monitor in a box in the attic, wrapped in the same blanket Caleb had used the night Samuel spoke his last words. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she would go up there and sit beside it. Not out of fear, not out of obsession, but something quieter. Gratitude, perhaps, or the ache of unfinished grace. Samuel Brewer's name faded from the news, as it had before. The missing posters were gone. His face, once etched into the fabric of a town, was now folded into memory. But he was not forgotten. He had become a part of the forest woven into its soil, stitched into the wind that passed through the trees. Not haunting, not entirely at peace, just there, in the quiet, in the pull of certain trails, in the hush of early morning fog, in the flicker of red when the sun touches the earth just right. The world had almost found him. And that, somehow, was enough. Almost.